Okay, today I want to talk to you about one of what I consider one of the most amazing cities in the world, Rio de Janeiro. We're going to spend 2 days in Rio, or as the locals would say, Io. They don't pronounce the R becomes kind of a muted H. So it's not Recife, it's Recife. I can't do it very well, so if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to use the English R pronunciation. So 2 days in Rio, and I think you're going to really enjoy this. Some of you are going to be leaving us in Rio, and some of you are going to be staying on. But all of us are going to have, I hope, a really good time when we are in Rio. As I mentioned the other day, Brazil is slightly smaller than the US. It's the fifth largest country in the world by population, seventh largest in the world by GDP. And a quick review if you missed my earlier talk. Brazil has a population of 204 million people, average age 29, which is really quite young. The country occupies about 47% of the South American continent. Language is, of course, Portuguese. And although they're having some financial problems right now, its economy has outweighed all other Latin American countries in terms of GDP. The currency is the Brazilian real or real, and if you're strictly going on ship tours and stuff, you don't need to worry about the money. But if you're going off independently, or you just want to get a coffee or a Coke or something in the process, you're going to need Brazilian currency. Now, we are going to be, I checked, and they are going to have them at the passenger service desk. You can get them there. You can also get them from ATMs. You all know by now, being world travelers, you have to be cautious using ATMs around the world. The best place to use an ATM is at a bank. Because that's the one that's most secure and the least likelihood that they're going to steal your numbers and also that they're going to rob you after you get your money. But I would not go off the ship personally without having some local money. That's just the way I travel. Now, as I said yesterday, like in the US or Canada, they have different states, and different states have different characteristics. You can't lump them all together. New York is not Nebraska, and it's different. And the same thing's true in Brazil. Manaus in the Amazonas is very different from Santos and São Paulo. From the state of Santos and São Paulo, where we're going. So, and like in the States, you have New York, the state, and then you have New York City. So you have Rio de Janeiro, the state, and then the biggest city in that is, of course, Rio, where we are headed. So the Brazilian state of Rio de Janeiro is one of the smallest states, but as you might expect, it's the third most populous with the second largest economy. 90% of that state used to be tropical rainforest, but large areas were deforested for coffee and sugar plantations. The state itself wasn't made a state until 1975, and it has always been dominated by the capital and the most famous city, Rio de Janeiro, as it still is today. But the state of Rio is a whole lot more than its famous namesake city. This is near Freiburg. It's called the Rio, Switzerland. It's a mountainous region of Rio State, about 136 kilometers or 85 miles from the city of Rio de Janeiro. It's home to 200,000 people. The main industries are clothing, textiles, and raising goats. And it's actually the oldest town in the state, but a far cry of what we typically think of when we think of Rio. The city of Rio was settled in 1565 by the Portuguese. When the Portuguese first saw the bay, they thought it was the end of a river, and it was January, and so they named their settlement there the River of January, or Rio de Janeiro. The iconic image of Rio is, of course, the statue of Christ the Redeemer, high on Mt Corcovado, overlooking Rio, which is the city of 6.3 million people, the second largest city in Brazil, and the sixth largest city in the world. In August of this year, Rio is going to host the 2016 Olympics and the Paralympics. So there's a whole lot of massive work going on to get everything ready for the Olympics this summer. And you'll notice that basically as soon as you step off the ship, because where we are docked in the port, step right outside the port and everything is ripped up and under construction, and you really need to watch where you are walking. There'll be temporary walks and boards, and it's a mess, but that's the way it is. So just be extremely cautious when you're walking around the area. That's why everything's so ripped up. The other iconic image is Sugarloaf Mountain. Rio has the second largest municipal GDP in the country, the 30th largest in the world. It's headquarters for many major companies, multiple universities, the Center for Research in Brazil. Unemployment was about 5.3%. Now it's about 8%. So you just need to be aware of it. And the other iconic image of Rio is Ipanema Beach, which is ranked by many as not only one of the most beautiful beaches in the world, but it has the sexiest beach in the world. But trust me, sexiness only goes so far, because despite what seems to be a rather sensual environment, it is nevertheless a Catholic country, and it is currently deemed an obscene act to go topless on the beach, punishable by between 3 months and a year in prison. Now, men, of course, are allowed to go topless, which has actually resulted in a number of topless protests by local women who are seeking equality. So, unfortunately, you're going to have to keep your tops on here, girls. Guys, you can just go flex all you want. So, although all the beaches are open to everyone, there's some that attract certain crowds. Lebanon works well for families because it's protected, it's safe for kids. Ipanema is the trendy beach favored by locals. And Copacabana is mixed, but you'll meet people on this giant beach, determined by what post you go by. That's how you tell where you're at. So, for example, the areas favored by gays is near post 3, 8, and 9. And if you're going to meet somebody, you say, well, I'll meet you at post 12 or whatever. That's how you find where you're going to be on this vast beach. One of our guests who lives in Brazil actually tipped me off to this the other day, and I think it's really, I forgot about this, but it's a great tip. Between the two beaches, in this point that juts out, there is an old fort that's been restored. That in itself is very interesting. In the fort, there's a very nice cafe where you can sit, have a drink. You get fantastic views of both beaches. But if you want to take pictures of the beach, if you're at this cafe, you're coming down looking this way, you get the fantastic beach picture of Copacabana with the Sugarloaf in the background. Here you get a fantastic beach picture. Go down this side, you get a fantastic picture looking down Ipanema with the mountains in the background. So if you're out wandering around, you might want to do that. Now, what comes to mind about the beach area for many is Barry Manilow's song, Copacabana, which is about Lola, a showgirl in a mythical nightclub, which is the hottest spot north of Havana. Supposedly about a nightclub in Cuba, but inspired not by a nightclub in Cuba, but by the real Copacabana Hotel in Rio de Janeiro, which, by the way, is south, not north of Havana. The Girl from Ipanema is about Rio. And if you go to Ipanema, you will definitely see the Girl from Ipanema walking around. The real Copacabana is an area of Rio, right along the water. 160,000 people live in Copacabana. And unlike the rest of the country, 28% of the residents of Copacabana are 60 years old or older. So some of us will feel right at home. Copacabana has about 40 bus routes, 3 metro stations to choose from. This is a big area. Both of these beaches are big areas. The Copacabana Promenade is 4 kilometers, or about 2.5 miles, was rebuilt in 1970 using a black and white Portuguese pavement design of a 1930s Art Deco geometric wave. And it's really, the promenade is a fascinating place. It is patrolled. It's quite safe, and at sunset, in early evening, it really comes alive. Now, when I say quite safe, that's in comparison. You don't want to just throw caution to the wind in Rio. You want to use common sense. And I don't know how to really make that any clearer, but that's what you need to do. Ipanema is one of the most expensive places to live in Rio. At the forefront of the beach culture are the many surfers and sun worshippers who socialize daily at the beach. Every Sunday they close the roadway, and it's closed to motor vehicles, and then everybody goes out and they roller skate, or they ride bikes, or they just skateboard, or walk, or talk, or visit, and walk along the ocean. Ipanema has played its own role in Rio's culture since its beginning. It holds its own street parade, which attracts up to 50,000 people to the streets of Ipanema for Carnival. Opposite the ocean, there are shops, cafes, trendy clubs, and when the sun sets, that's the place to go for evening dancing, drinking, and socializing. Now, yet another iconic image of Brazil, and Rio in particular, are the favelas. Favelas, or slums, or neighborhoods that sprawl up the hills behind some of the most expensive real estate in Rio. Now, in Rio, in Brazil as a whole, but it comes to be very visible in Rio, there's this wide disparity of wealth between people who are very wealthy and people who basically have very little. So the favelas, which are right up next to the big, most expensive areas, are a nightmare for city planners and for law enforcement. Houses are thrown up, forget all about permits and building codes, and the people jerry-rig electrical connections, hooking onto city water lines and into city electric systems without permission, and just do it yourself. So it really, in many ways for the city, is a nightmare. The favelas started in the 19th century when soldiers came back and they had no place to live. Many of them were in areas formerly occupied by freed slaves, but never had any land ownership. And before the advent of the favelas, the poor had just been pushed away from the city, forced to live in suburbs or the countryside. But during the 1970s, there was kind of a rural exodus from the outer areas into the city, and people were unable to find affordable places to live, so they just threw up at first shacks, and then those shacks became more substantial but illegal dwellings. So today about 11.4 million people live in this kind of illegal, often structurally unsafe housing. And if you're poor and you have no opportunity and you're surrounded by wealth, of course there's going to be an increase in crime and the desire to escape or find quick money through drugs. So you mix poverty, drugs, and disaffected youth together, and you get local gangs and enormous problems. And that's one of the problems that Rio is facing. On several occasions, gangs from the nearby favelas have stormed the popular tourist beaches in Rio. You're laying on the beach, and here comes this gang in, beating everybody up, stealing everything in sight, even chasing those who tried to escape or salvage their valuables, who ran into the water, chasing them into the water and beating them up in the water. So if you were going to go even to the nice beaches, someone who's from this area had told me that the thing you really ought to do is go to one of the better hotels. The better hotels will have all their area which is set up with lounges and umbrellas. And so you buy a chair and you buy an umbrella, and the reason why you do that is because on either side at the better hotels they'll have guards patrolling back and forth to try to improve your safety. The beaches are all public, but you just want to keep in mind that, you know, use common sense, and you don't want to stick out any more than absolutely necessary as a tourist. It's not that the police aren't trying to root out the gang element. They're fighting, in many cases, a pitched battle with the favela gangs. And it certainly doesn't help when this year you got the 2016 Olympics coming. A few years back, the police began what they called a pacification program, where they went in and began to try and help the residents treating and responding to some of the needs of the community, driving out the drugs, the drug sellers, the drug lords, and they've made major advances on this. So they started with a single hillside favela and made advances making it safe, so then they moved on to the next one and moved on to the next one, and it is an ongoing project. But what has happened, however, is that the drug lords and gangs now have been forced into a few favelas, which they definitely control. And instead of many, they're all in this one, but they're very powerful, one or two, and the police are constantly fighting for control. Now, not all the favelas are crime-ridden and gang-controlled. Some of the favelas have some of the best samba schools that compete in Carnival. Others have community-based programs. Many of the people who live there are the people who work in the hotels, who are involved in the tourist trade, and they just can't afford anything else, so that's where they live. Many of them are the people that make the costumes for Carnival. So they work, they're good citizens, but they're stuck in favelas with no other options. And the gangs and organized crime, unfortunately, give the entire favela community a bad name and reputation. There's actually a tour company called Favela Tours that takes you into a real favela which has been turned around. You get a chance to meet the people, to go into their homes, to have lunch, and then you get to find out what life is really like in one of the favela communities that has been turned around through the pacification program. Unfortunately, the ships aren't offering these tours, but if you go to favelatours.com.br for Brazil, you can get their website and maybe make arrangements to go on one of these tours. Now, my job is not to scare you. I don't want to scare you about Rio, but I do want to help you understand Rio and some of the problems, and to get you to enjoy the beauty and fun that Rio offers, as well as bring you back alive. But to do that, you need to use common sense. So I would suggest that particularly in Rio, you be extremely cautious and that you seriously consider taking a ship's tour. There are no guarantees. If you wanted a guarantee of safety, you would have never gotten on the plane or taken a cruise. And you sure as heck wouldn't have driven to the airport, because that's where the biggest danger in the world is, on that ride from your home to the airport. Getting out of bed in the morning requires an element of risk. But you take precautions, use common sense, and that's what I want you to do. Rio's a fantastic city. Like Paris or San Francisco, there's just nothing like it. So enjoy it, but use common sense. And I can tell that you are all experienced travelers. I know I'm just preaching to the choir, but just please keep that in mind. So on to happier stuff. Christ the Redeemer sits atop Corcovado Mountain, Rio's highest peak. The Art Deco concrete and soapstone structure was designed by a team of artists and engineers, was constructed from 1922 to 1931. It was paid for by donations from Brazil's Roman Catholic community. It's 38 meters or 125 feet tall from the base of the pedestal, weighs 635 metric tons, or for you Brits, that's 625 long tons. For U.S. Americans, it's 700 short tons. It's a heavy statue, guys, any way you cut it. The statue was struck by lightning in 2008 and 2014 and did require some repairs each time. Since we're lucky enough to have 2 days in Rio, and we're going to be there overnight, you will hopefully, if it doesn't fog in, see some of the many moods of the statue throughout the day and night. Now, there is a cogwheel train that runs up the mountain to the statue. You don't have to walk or hike up there. But understand that the wait for the train, both up and down, can be an hour or more. So understand that if you're planning to go up to the summit. Take along a paperback book or something you can read while you stand in line, or travel companions that you can carry on a nice conversation with. The other iconic image is Sugarloaf Mountain. I'm told that we won't see the good view coming into the port because we're coming in from the north. But when we're leaving, weather permitting, going southbound, you should have a great view of the mountain, and you want to be up on deck for that. It rises 396 meters or 1,299 feet above the harbor. The name is said to refer to its resemblance to the traditional shape of concentrated refined loaf sugar, which doesn't mean much to us because it's not how we see sugar now. We think of a 5-pound paper bag, right? But historically, Brazilians viewed sugar in this way. When sugar was dried, and part of the bleaching process was to put it in a pot-shaped container. And then when it was finished and dry and had been bleached, they would turn over the container and take the container away, and you had this kind of container-shaped pile of sugar, which is what the mountain reminded them of, and so that's why it's called Sugarloaf Mountain. It's what's geologically called a Barnhart mountain that is a dome-shaped, steep-sided, bald rock outcropping at least 30 meters or 100 feet high and several hundred meters in width. Sugarloaf is one of several monolithic granite and quartz mountains that rise straight up from the water's edge around Rio, which is something that makes Rio so unique and special. Sugarloaf is accessible by a cable car. It's known as a teleférico. It's capable of holding, each car holds 65 passengers. It runs along a 1,400-meter route between the peaks of Sugarloaf Mountain and Morro del Urica every 20 minutes. The original cable line car was built in 1912. It has been rebuilt, was rebuilt in 1972 and 1973, rebuilt again in 2009. So if you don't have a height thing, that really would be an exciting thing to do. The Cathedral of Rio, and this is the new cathedral, dedicated to Saint Sebastian, the patron saint of Rio, was designed by Edgar Fonseca in a modern style based on the Mayan architectural style of pyramids. The church was constructed between 1964 and 1979. Inside the church measures 8,000 square meters, or about 86,000 square feet, has seating for 5,000 with standing room capacity of 20,000. The ceiling rises 75 meters, or 246 feet high. There are 4 gigantic stained glass windows that soar 64 meters, or 210 feet from the floor to the ceiling, and at the top is a glass white cross. It's very different, very awe-inspiring. Pope Francis preached here during his visit to Rio last year for a World Youth Festival. So it really is a remarkable thing. It's quite different from the old cathedral that it replaced. The old cathedral is the Church of Our Lady of Mt Carmel of the Ancient Sea. It's a Carmelite church that served as the Cathedral of Rio from about 1808 to 1976. During the 19th century, it was used successively as a royal and imperial chapel by both the Portuguese royal family and the Brazilian imperial family. Very traditional, very busy inside, nothing of the clean, uncluttered lines of the new cathedral. This forest is actually a tropical rainforest completely within the city of Rio. It covers 32 square kilometers, 12.4 square miles, claims to be the world's largest urban forest, and actually within this forest is the statue of Christ the Redeemer. What is interesting about the forest is that it's a man-made reclamation of land around Rio that had previously been indiscriminately cleared and developed to grow sugar and coffee. And they decided that they were going to restore this. Replanting was carried out in the second half of the 19th century in a successful effort to protect Rio's water supply. This followed concerns made by the Brazilian Emperor Pedro II in 1861 about erosion and deforestation caused by intensive farming. It's interesting that in 1861, this guy had already figured this out, and we're just now beginning to figure some of this stuff out. There were declining levels of rainfall. That had begun to impact the supply of drinking water for Rio, and so his solution was to build or reconstruct replant a tropical rainforest within the city. The vegetation is so dense that scientists have estimated that the ambient temperatures in surrounding areas in the city have been lowered by up to 9 degrees centigrade or 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The forest also contains some 30 waterfalls, and it's all in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Not exactly what everybody thinks about when they think about Rio. And one of the most popular ways to explore the forest is on half-day Jeep tours that take you around in the forest. If you're looking for something to do independently, there is a beautiful botanic garden that's filled with tropical trees and plants and these remarkable heliconia flowers. And that is also in the town, and maybe on your free day, or if you're doing a tour one day and the other day you want to go do something, you may want to think about going to the botanical gardens. Now, we can't talk about Rio without talking about Carnival. And I want you to know that I have very carefully examined this picture, very close up. And since being topless is banned in Rio's beaches, but really she isn't topless. She's just wearing a very sheer bra. Almost as tiny as her G-string. Or it could just be her tan line. I'm not exactly sure. But how did all this carnival stuff come about? Well, the word carnival actually comes from the Latin, ironically, named the Latin word that stood for farewell to the flesh, or taking away the flesh. You can see that they did a lot. They do a lot of that, which developed as a Catholic tradition of holding a wild costume party the night before the first day of Lent, when Catholics gave up eating meat and eventually supposedly gave up some other fleshly privileges. Gradually, it evolved into a much longer festival. So Carnival really began in Venice in 1268. It was an opportunity for a very strict and organized society, an opportunity for people to break loose, but the church forbade it officially. Unofficially, the clergy would dress up to party and fornicate like everybody else. And because of this, you didn't want to know who was out there doing what. That's how masks emerged in this climate of religious and cultural repression. Gentry and peasants alike sought anonymity for their indiscretions. And actually the mask tradition spread so that at one time masks and the accompanying anonymous activities were permitted almost 6 months of the year in Venice. So eventually the mask makers had their own guild and enjoyed very high prestige in Venice. Party! Yes. Okay. So, of course, in Rio, you don't have to hide your face or almost anything else. Because of the widespread introduction of African slaves in the New World, African traditions began to merge with the European carnival traditions, and as time passed, carnivals in Italy became quite famous. And the practice spread then to France, Spain, and all the Catholic countries in Europe. Then as the French, Spanish, and Portuguese began to take control of the Americas and other parts of the world, they brought with them their traditions of celebrating Carnival. So many African slaves were imported to the Caribbean and to Brazil, so there's strong African influences in Carnival. Dancing in circles through the village was in African tradition believed to bring good fortune. It was time to chill out to angry relatives who had moved on to the next world, and spirits and stuff like that. So objects like bones, grasses, beads, feathers, masks, and costumes, all those represented spiritual forces. So feathers, for example, symbolized the ability to rise above human pain, heartbreak, and illness, to rise up to another world. So you have this great mingling of traditions that has eventuated into what we call Carnival in Rio today. And above all, there was the influence of African music, featuring rhythm and drums on simple man-made instruments, which in the days of slavery became all kinds of things. What might have been considered scrap on the plantations, those things were all used to make music, and the dance and culture all evolved around that. So that dominates much of life in Carnival. and in Rio today. And much of social life in Rio for the locals centers around the various samba schools that all compete in Carnival. And then after Carnival comes Ash Wednesday, where you can either head to church and ask for forgiveness or just sleep it all off. But that's kind of up to you. So the Sambadrome was actually built in 1984. That's the heart of what happens in the Carnival Parade. It consists of a 700-meter or about 2,300-foot stretch of street converted into a permanent parade ground with bleachers built on either side for spectators, has a capacity of about 90,000 people. And then at the end of the parade route is a giant square with bleachers where participants gather to party when they've completed their march through the Sambadrome, and they can celebrate. Of course, by the light of day, when it's not Carnival, it looks a whole lot different. But it's still fascinating, and a really fascinating thing to see, and to be there and close your eyes and just imagine what it's like when it's filled with the whole Carnival celebration. The Sambadrome today is actually being upgraded, enlarged by 18,000 seats, so it'll be over 100,000 people, being enlarged for the 2016 Olympics, where it will be the venue for archery and marathon events. There's also a museum there, which if you go out there, which displays a whole lot of Carnival memorabilia as well. Now, what you may not expect, and we haven't had a lot of, Brazil has a long, very interesting history. But remember, Brazil was a colony originally of the Kingdom of Portugal until 1808, when the Portuguese king, regent, fled Napoleon's invasion of Portugal to Brazil and established the Kingdom of Brazil, which after 7 years became the Empire of Brazil, including what is today the countries of Brazil and Uruguay. So the empire became independent in 1822 and was governed by a representative parliamentary constitutional monarchy, which had a titular monarch known as the emperor. And there were two emperors in Brazil, Pedro I and Pedro II. Unlike most of the neighboring countries, Brazil enjoyed political stability, economic growth, guaranteed freedom of speech, and respect for civil rights of its subjects, albeit with legal restrictions on women and slaves. Slaves were regarded as property, not as people, not as citizens. Pedro II was a weak, symbolic leader who eventually was overthrown by a coup, and a dictatorship ensued. But the idyllic mountain town of Petrópolis, which we have a tour going up to, is 68 kilometers, about 42 miles from the capital city of Rio. And it became the mountain retreat and the summer home of Pedro II. It's nestled among the forest mountain hills. It's an ideal climate because of the elevation. The town has become known as the Imperial City, and it's popular today as an escape from the city, a winter resort, and it's home to the National Laboratory for Scientific Computing. The Palácio Rio Negro was built in 1889 by a wealthy Brazilian nobleman. 7 years later, it was sold to the state to serve as today the official residence of the governor. Today, the Palácio Rio Negro is a kind of Camp David retreat for the president of Brazil. Now, we're going to be 2 days in Brazil, 2 days in Rio. And so one day you may want to do the city. The other day you may want to go up and see a whole different side of Brazil and history. The real gem, so to speak, of Petrópolis is the Imperial Palace. This was the former summer palace of the Emperor Pedro II. Was built in 1845. In 1943, it was converted to be the Imperial Museum, and it showcases the crown jewels of Brazil, China furniture, artwork, and the gardens of the Imperial Court. Something totally different that you probably didn't expect in Brazil, and certainly the folks back home don't expect in Brazil. The town itself is charming with a definite European feel. I mean, you look at this picture and you think, oh, it must be in Amsterdam or something, but it's in Brazil. And it's a 2.5-hour ride up to the town, so you get to see some special, spectacular scenery en route, and you get to see something other than the glitz and glitter of Rio. So we are going to be docking at the pier, which is within walking distance to the central business district, but it is not a tourist area, and it is not recommended to walk in the area around the port. And actually, in addition to the crime problems, it's kind of dodgy, but in addition, there's enormous work being done for right outside. You step outside the port, and things are all ripped up in preparation for the Olympics, and things are under construction, and they've sent us, the local tour operator sent us some pictures, and it is a mess. So you need to be careful. You need to walk carefully. Usually, Stern, the jewelers, and other people may have hawkers at the pier offering you free rides, naturally to go to their stores, frequently to the store at Ipanema. It's free, and you can't beat that. And of course, they want you to look at and buy things in their store, but they never force you to that. You can just go in, browse around, and leave. No problem with that. Some people don't even go in. But some people do end up buying some really nice stuff there, and that makes it worthwhile for them to offer this free shuttle. Now, I've taken these shuttles in Brazil and elsewhere, or in Rio and elsewhere in Brazil, and they're a whole lot more eager and organized to get you to their store than they are getting you back to the ship. So sometimes it can take a while, and you end up kind of having to wait a long time to get the ride back to the ship. With your limited time in port, I'm not sure that's what you want to do, free or not. But what I've sometimes done is taken their shuttle out to Ipanema and then take a cab or something back to the ship if I don't want to wait, or I just want to go around and not come back. But that is generally available. There's also a modern metro system. I'm not sure it would be my choice. The station nearest the port is a rather long walk from the cruise terminal, and since things are pretty ripped up for construction around the port, and it's not the best area, you probably would want to take a cab to get there, and it might be easier just to take a cab where you want to go. But whether you want to believe it or not, you will stick out as a tourist. No matter how hard we try, somehow it's written on the top of our head. Of course, it's going to be, the directions are going to be primarily in Portuguese. Now, we're only here a couple days, and I'm not sure you want to waste all your time figuring this out. In preparation for the Olympics, and in all fairness, I suspect that many of these signs have already been adapted to be both Portuguese and English, and maybe a couple other languages as well. Rio has a vast bus system of 831 bus lines. Again, it's a complicated system, mostly in Portuguese, so I'm not sure you want to bother with that. The fees start at only 250 reals, so that's not much money. But even the bus people advise, quote, watch your wallet, as pickpockets are known to ride the bus looking for easy marks. Really? I never knew that. Same thing in New York, San Francisco, everywhere. I'm sure it's a good system, but it takes a little time to get used to. And again, it's your choice. As far as I know, there is no hop-on, hop-off tourist bus there, none that I know of. There are many good independent tour guides in Brazil, like these folks. Tour guides must be licensed to operate in Brazil. They have to have this card with them, okay? And there may be, and there are, as in every port, there are unreputable, unlicensed people who are cruising near the terminal offering tours. If you want an independent tour, I'd check out the recommendations on sites like Cruise Critic. Do your own research, book in advance. I would not just pick somebody off the street, and if I did, I definitely want to see their license and make sure it was valid. A few years ago, a young couple booked a van tour. The driver picked up a few of his friends just to give them a lift en route, and for the couple, it ended up 6 horrific hours of the guy being beaten with a tire changer and the woman being repeatedly gang raped. So stuff happens. It happens everywhere. I understand that. But you don't want it to happen to you. So if you are going to do it independently, you want to see a license that looks something like this. And if not, I would avoid it entirely. So this is Rio, Disney's cartoon character. And Rio says about the city, Rio, the city. If you don't need it, leave it on board. Don't take it with you. Don't leave anything unattended at the beach unless you want to do a disappearing act. Keep your money accessible, but keep some reserve tucked away somewhere. Now, everybody knows about the passport things that are inside. They expect, if you're a tourist, they expect you're going to have one of those. They expect you're going to have money hidden. So, yeah. But anyhow, I'd have some money available if you need it to give to somebody who's going to kill you if they don't get anything, and also some tucked away for emergencies. Don't take your passport, you know that. Government-issued picture ID, I'd take that along. I'd take any port we go to, I'd take a photocopy of your passport. That's what you need. Stay hydrated, watch where you walk. Always be aware of your surroundings, be aware of what's going on. In any port, if you see a demonstration building or something, get out of there. Don't hang around. And don't take any jewelry or watches. I don't care if it's just plastic. Don't take it. You don't want somebody to knock you over to rip off a cheap plastic piece of jewelry or a knockoff watch or whatever. Just don't take the jewelry. Don't take watches. Dress down. Try not to look like a tourist. It's tough, folks, but at least try. And try not to look like one or act like one, and use caution, use common sense, and we're all going to get back here, and we're going to have a great time in Rio. But just use your head and be cautious, and things will go well. Now, for those of you who are leaving us in Rio, who have later flights and don't particularly enjoy hanging out at the airport waiting for your flights, there are a number of Rio tours that are available. We call them disembarkation tours. So you leave the ship with your luggage. Luggage is in the bottom of the bus. You go see some of Rio, whatever. And then in time to make your flight, they take you, they drop you and your luggage off in the airport. You don't have to stay in this mass of people all day. So if you have questions, talk to the guys talk to Fernando at the ShoreX office, and he'll explain what's available and set you up. It's much better than just sitting at the airport waiting. So coming up, I'll be talking a little bit about the oil of the 17th century globalization, the role that sugar and rum played. This relates to where we've been in the Caribbean, and also definitely relates to Brazil, where sugar was a major product and a major part of life and history in Brazil. So thank you very much, guys, and have a great day on board the ship. We'll see you later.